All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. This is our last author talk of Sci-Fi September 2024. For those who are unaware, every year in September, Mountain View Public Library hosts a variety of events celebrating science fiction, fantasy, and the real-life science that inspires the stories. Tonight, we are so thrilled to be joined by John G. Hemry, better known as his pen name, Jack Campbell. He's the author of the new Doomed Earth series, the New York Times bestselling Lost Fleet series, Genesis Fleet series, and Lost Stars series, as well as the Steampunk-meets-high-fantasy Pillars of Reality, Dragon's Legacy, and Empress of the Endless Sea series. His most recent books are In Our Stars, Implacable, in the Lost Fleet series, Outlands, and the Lost Fleet universe short fiction collection, Rendezvous with Corsair. He wrote the scripts for Titan's Lost Fleet Corsair comic series, and his young adult novel, The Sister Paradox, won the Epic 2018 eBook Young Reader Award. He's also the author of The Last Full Measure, which is a standalone alternate history novella. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Jack Campbell. Thank you so much for joining us, John.
Glad to be here.
All right. Well, so since this is our last sci-fi author talk in our month-long celebration of sci-fi, I wanted to start by asking you, what made you fall in love with science fiction, and who are some of your biggest literary influences?
Well, falling in love, when I was young, by the time I was in fifth grade, I'd read a great deal of history and also mythology. Read a lot of mythology, mostly Greek, but also from every other place in the world that I could find. And then one day I stumbled across a book called The Mastermind of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, which I guess today would be classified as science fantasy. But this was a revelation to me because somebody had made up their own history and made up their own mythology and written a story about it. And I thought that was pretty amazing. And then later on, as I got more into it, I learned that science fiction lets you examine familiar situations in new ways, because you can take a situation where people have a lot of preconceptions already that govern how they see it, change a lot of the names and the actors, and present it in a new way, and people could see things in a different way. So that's why I've stuck with it and continue to enjoy it. It gives tremendous scope to the settings for stories.
Absolutely.
Um,
And yeah,
Influences. Well, a lot of I mean, I'm still reading, of course. A lot of my primary influences are people like Andre Norton, Lee Brackett, um, Poul Anderson, people who were writing in the 60s and 70s. Um, I picked up a lot of lessons from them. I'll never be able to write as well as somebody like Lee Brackett, but I'm inspired by her. So, um, but I read just about everything I could back then.
that's great. And so, as I mentioned in your introduction, you you have actually, I think I might have neglected to mention this, but you have a professional background as a naval officer, which certainly comes through in your writing. Your books are often dubbed military sci-fi by readers and critics alike. I'd love to hear about your transition. How did you go from naval officer to New York Times bestselling author? And were you always interested in creative writing? Has your military and how has your military experience informed your writing?
Well, yes, I've like most people who become writers, I guess I'd always wanted to be a writer. Did some writing in high school, most of which I hope has been, all of which I hope has been destroyed by now, no remaining copies. Um, and I went to the Navy, and there wasn't much time or luxury for creative writing in the Navy, but I did learn an awful lot about writing uh, what was supposed to be nonfiction, copy editing, checking myself, writing clearly and concisely, those kinds of things. Then I was coming up on retirement, and my wife suggested I go ahead and give writing full-time a try. Uh, well, I mean, we had two kids at that point and a third on the way, and so I could stay home, be the full-time caregiver for them, and also write. So that's how I made that transition. I just started writing short stories at first, and then eventually went into longer things. And writing's like anything else. You learn it by doing it. So the more I wrote, the better I got at it. And even got some occasional feedback from editors, which is usually hard to do in this in today's world. Um, but mainly just learned by doing, and that's how I eventually worked it into it. And yeah, the naval experience was very valuable in all respects of that.
And how do you feel about that military sci-fi moniker that some have dubbed your work?
Well, the subgenre, I mean, in one sense, it helps audiences looking for that to identify you. But in another sense, it also limits your potential audience. People saying, oh, I wouldn't want that. I'm not interested in that particular thing. And I think that's true of whatever the subgenre is. Um, I often call them simply space opera or science fiction adventure or just science fiction, um, because yeah, it's not that I'm embarrassed or ashamed by it, but I don't want people to think that it falls into some narrow perceived stereotype of what a certain type of novel is. Um, so um, people will put labels on things, and hopefully those labels will be inclusive of large audiences rather than seen as labels to limit the audience.
Great. And so for those in the audience who haven't yet read your latest novel, In Our Stars, could you briefly describe the concept of the story and maybe tell us what inspired you to write it?
Well, those things sort of go together. There was a novel that Andre Norton wrote back in the early 60s called Secret of the Lost Race, which is about um, a young protagonist who doesn't know that he's the product of a human alien. He's a hybrid. And so he doesn't know why all these people are trying to capture and kill him. It's not until the end that he finds out the secret of this. And I thought, what if this was written today? Um, Norton kind of avoided discussing the issue of the prejudice against him until the very end. But, what if everybody knew from the beginning that this individual had um, some alien DNA among their human DNA? How would that result in their upbringing? So that was kind of the core of the idea. Plus, well, as I said, science fiction lets you examine current situations in different lights. So um, the novel opens in 2180 when the protagonist with some partly alien DNA, Celine Genji, is in a ship in orbit near the moon and witnesses the Earth being destroyed in the culmination of a universal war, which is about many things, but also partly about aliens, fear of aliens. And then that, the forces unleashed by that, hurl a section of the wreckage of her ship that she's in 40 years into the past. She finds herself in 2140. Doesn't realize that at first, of course, where she encounters an Earth Guard ship in this earlier period, which is just before alien contact, first contact has ever occurred, before any of these things have gone to pieces and the institutions have totally failed. She's in a time of where everything's fairly peaceful, everything seems to be working, and nobody can even conceive of a future in which everything's going to fall apart and everything's going to be destroyed. So I wanted to address all those things, the fear of an aliens, and how that would drive our reactions to first contact and what someone could do in such a situation, um, how these institutions that are keeping things quiet, how they could fail through neglect and other reasons, um, and just generally tell a story of two young adult protagonists who are trying to do the right thing, regardless of the price they pay. And because of you've got the time travel thing worked in there, the man who becomes her primary ally in 2140, Kyle, um, he realizes they're trying to change the future somehow, even though they don't know how. But he does know that every time they make any change to the future, it increases the chances that her existence is going to be canceled out. And as he starts really caring about her, he finds himself wondering, is saving the Earth worth creating a universe in which this woman never existed and I never met her? So I try to humanize the scale of the argument in that way. And I think that would be a real concern if you were actually dealing with time travel. Um, so it's all of those things, but really it's looking at how prejudice can drive uh, people to do things without thinking about them, and how the institutions that are supposed to hold things together can fail if they're not given sufficient attention. A lot of things, I guess, but it's also supposed to be a fun read.
And it certainly is. And yeah, your answer there really led perfectly into my next question. So, like many other great classic sci-fi novels, In Our Stars draws parallels to many of the issues plaguing our society today, like xenophobia and otherism. How do you manage to weave social commentary into your work in a way that's organic and serves the story without feeling preachy or feeling like too obvious?
Well, I try to keep its impacts on a personal scale. If you're telling the story of an individual and how these things impact the individual, then I think it's much easier for people to see the actual impacts of these events and not, simply dismiss it as, well, these others. That if you put a name and a face on things, then it will help people um, see the problems without having to resort to polemics, as you say. I always try to avoid that because I don't think people respond well to being preached to in science fiction or any other form of literature. Um, so I'm just trying to set out, this is what's happening to these people, and this is why they're being going through all this, and let people draw their own conclusions, so to speak, about um, about what that all means.
And you've mentioned in the past that meditations by Roman Emperor Marcus
Yes.
Aurelius played a surprising role in the writing of the story. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, characters, at least my characters, and I've talked to a lot of other authors about this. Characters don't always do what they're supposed to do. They as you write the story, they show you aspects of themselves that you didn't plan on. And in the case of Celine, it turned out she really liked and admired Marcus Aurelius and was constantly drawing on quotes from his meditations to help guide her through situations, because she had been, her childhood had been pretty much hell, since everyone knew she was part alien. And she had been looking for a source of guidance through her life that she could turn to and comfort about things to do. And that's really, Marcus Aurelius says a lot of things that are quite acceptable, no matter your religious inclinations or whatever, saying things like, if it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. I mean, that's a pretty simple moral principle to live your life by. I mean, it's really hard to do in practice, but it's a simple thing to propound. So that was a case where she's just surprised me by her devotion to that, which created some problems with the manuscript because, um, as my editor pointed out, the meditations themselves are not copyrighted anymore, but the translations are still copyrighted. So I had to get permission to use the specific translations I was using.
Ah, that's interesting. And I find it fascinating how you say that kind of writing the character sort of revealed things about them in the process. I'm curious, like, how does that work for you? Are you someone who kind of plots things out ahead of times, or you tend to just kind of start writing and see where it takes you?
Well, I, of course, I always know where a story starts, but I think it's very important to know, at least in general terms, where it's going, what the ending is going to be. Um, and then I trust to the characters to take me from the start to the end. We kind of go on the journey together, and along the way, they may take paths I did not expect, and do things I don't expect, change their relationships in ways I don't expect. But as long as I know and the characters know what that end is going to be, we pretty much stay on track to get there. So I don't really do detailed plots. I trust the characters to show me the way. And so far, this worked out pretty well, but they will complicate things. In the Lost Fleet series, two major characters who were not supposed to have a relationship, ended up falling in love. And I just had to deal with that. Um, make it fit in the story and make everything still work right. Because characters will do whatever they are. They really feel like really real people in that respect. And I think that translates into the reading experience, that they feel real as well to the reader, because they're not following some jumping through these hoops because the plot demands it. Instead, this is the path that they're choosing because this is who they are.
Absolutely. And so Inner Stars is just the book one of your two-part Doomed Earth duology. Why did you opt to stick to a shorter two-part series as opposed to a trilogy or a longer series? Is this something that maybe started as a single standalone novel that wouldn't fit into one book? It's kind of odd. We don't see duologies that often.
No, although my publisher was happy with it, so I guess they're looking at that. Um, Basically, it was what C.J. Cherry summed up as saying, a story is just so long and no longer. Um, or I guess to put it in Tolkien terms, a story is never too short or too long. It is always precisely as long as it needs to be. And when I was writing it, knowing generally where it was going, I realized that a part where I was originally thinking trilogy, but when I was getting to the point where I was going to end the first book, it was too short for a modern novel. So I realized I would have to go to another point that I had already looked ahead to, and that length and the length of the following story made it a duology, a much better fit for the story length that I had at that point. I didn't want to pad it out for the sake of making it a trilogy. Um, and trying to cram it all into one book. It would have been possible if I was willing to print a very big, a really long book, but I didn't want to do that either. So two books turned out to be the right length for the story.
Oh, that's great. And I apologize. I hopefully you can't hear there are some sirens outside my door, so hopefully that's not.
Oh, can't hear them now.
Oh, good, good. And so as a follow-up, when is book two coming out? I believe you said you've already completed it, correct?
February.
Oh, okay, cool. So that's
Yeah, it'll
coming
be
out pretty
coming out in
soon then.
February. Yeah, and that's a weird thing about writing, the writing business. You never know what publishers are going to do. In the case of this particular series, the contract they gave me for the two books um, specified that I had to turn in the second book in March of 2023 and the first book in May of 2023. So the second book was due months before the first book. When I saw that, I asked my agent if that was a typo, and he said, no, no, that's what they want. So, but yes, the second book, which is Destiny's Way, will be coming out in February.
And so does that take place just directly after the events of book
Yes,
one?
yes. You've In Our Stars ends on a cliffhanger, and it Destiny's Way picks up right there and takes you through that.
Okay, so I'm assuming you probably can't share too much without giving away spoilers.
Um, well, they survive. Um, Basically, yeah, they're back on Earth and having various adventures. And some new important characters show up to help things along. Basically, it continues the pattern of the first book in that Celine's mere presence 40 years in the past, before she was supposed to even exist, is knocking over dominoes right and left, whether she does anything or not particular. Just the fact that she's there is causing changes. And they have to try and somehow um, still control the changes in ways they think best, or at least try to ride with them. So in that sense, it's a continuation of the first book.
Great. And I wanted to talk a bit about your research process. Of course, your books take place in a pretty distant future, so you can kind of take some liberties as far as technological advancements and things. Obviously, time travel is not something that we have the ability to do at this moment. But I'm curious, what level of research goes into planning these future societies and the technology and all of that?
Well, when you're writing, it should all make sense. It should all hang together. A certain level of technology and what's happening in the society, though, all those things should be integrated properly so that when you see it, it doesn't seem ridiculous that these people can create anything they want, but there's still scarcity. That wouldn't make sense. So I approach it from the perspective of trying to create an entire situation that holds together an entire scenario. And I bring in the technology at the points where it's necessary to discuss it. And then I take the approach of just giving this is what it is, not this is how it works, because I don't know how it works. So I don't go into a lot of detail. And basically, I'm just trying to build a scenario that makes sense in terms of the story, but also carries the story forward in believable ways. Um, and so, for example, with the Lost Fleet series, I had to give a lot of thought to the environment of space and how to deal with it. It's very hard because space is so incredibly immense. Human minds have a great deal of trouble just grasping how huge it is. Um, and it turned out that taking into account real world physics in terms of light speed and other things solved a lot of that problem for me because, yeah, humans don't really know what 10 trillion miles means. That's just a huge number. We don't know how big that is. But if you say, for example, that light itself takes an hour to reach that point from where you are, that's something we can somehow grasp a little bit and say that's a long ways. So that helped me set things and in other ways build things that both furthered the story and made sense in terms of the story. So it's kind of a dual thing. I also make very sure to always include limitations in the technology because what drives a story isn't just what your characters can do, it's also very much what they cannot do, even if they wish they could, because that forces you to write better. It forces you to write realistically. That's our lives. There's all sorts of things we'd love to do, but it's beyond our capability. And that's the case for the protagonist in the story, too. These are the things they want to do. Well, how are they going to do it with what's available to them, with the means they have? So a lot of it is thinking about what the technology cannot do in this future time, and that human ingenuity um, and courage and everything else can somehow find a solution to anyway. Long answer, but I think I got to what you're asking.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really kind of leads to my question here about world building. So your novels are really highly regarded for their immersive world building, and it really transports you to this alternate future society. I've had the pleasure of interviewing several sci-fi authors in this Sci-Fi September series who've told me that sometimes they even kind of draw rough sketches of their fictional worlds and of
Hmm.
particular scenes. I'm curious, when you're creating a futuristic fictional world from scratch and creating these tactical battle scenes, do you use any tools to help you visualize them, or does that all just kind of take place in your head and on the page?
Well, in terms of something like the Lost Fleet has three-dimensional battles in space over vast distances. And frankly, I don't know how I would draw that out. So that happens in my head. That's my Navy experience, which I was a ship driver. I understand relative motion and the momentum of really big things moving in certain directions that want to change the direction. So, and then using aviator hands to model the movements in three dimensions. But that's something I had to do in my head entirely. But I also work out what's the star system like that they're in? Where are the planets? How big are they? Because they're going to play a role in things. When I did my uh, what's called the Steampunk with Dragon series, the Pillars of Reality, I actually did create a map of the world, both to help guide my writing and to um, help readers figure out where things were happening and everything that was going on. There's definitely situations where you want to have a map if possible. In other situations, like in our stars, well, that's taking place on Earth. People can look up places if they want to know where. Oh, LA, okay, here's LA. Um, so they can we can establish those things. But it's definitely a good idea, if possible, to um, establish a map for certain locations if they're not well known, or if you're looking at some specific um, area in a city or something, to really spell that out. Because again, that gets to what you can and can't do. It matters whether or not you can get from this place to that place within a certain period of time, and what it requires to get from this place to that place. One of the things I learned as a writer was that there's a tendency to want to jump from exciting scene to exciting scene and ignore the stuff in between. But that stuff in between, that can be a huge story in and of itself. And it can really influence the development of that next scene. So you really don't want to skip over that stuff because that tends to be really important. So yes, definitely. When I can, I do try to create visual aids for myself and for the reader.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also just want to remind folks in the audience here, we will have some time for audience Q&A at the end. So highly encourage you all to submit questions for the author if you have any. Feel free to use our Q&A in our chat. So I wanted to ask you about your Lost Fleet series. You've stated in previous interviews that the inspiration for that series was partially sparked by a discussion with another author about Star Trek. I'd love to hear
Yes.
about that.
Yes. Well, it was an author who worked in the Star Trek universe, and they asked a bunch of us other authors whether you could do a long retreat scenario in Star Trek. And we all said, no, you can't really do that in Star Trek because of the way Star Trek handles faster than light travel. You either get trapped right away or you get away right away. But it did get me to thinking, could you do a good long retreat scenario in space? And the classic long retreat in human history is Xenophon's March of the 10,000. So could I do that in space and have it feel at all plausible? Um, but then there was another idea that had been bouncing around in the back of my head for a long time, which dealt with a common piece of human myth. It's found in cultures all over the world, and that's the myth of the sleeping hero. That some great figure from the past isn't dead. Instead, they are sleeping, maybe with a lot of their warriors or whatever, under a mountain usually. And when they're really needed, they're going to wake up and come and save the day. And it's generally agreed that these great heroes of the past, they're based on real people. And so you have to wonder, what if that person really did wake up century, 2, 3 centuries in the future? And everybody said, "Yay, our great hero, you're here to save us." And they would probably go, "What? Who do you think I am?" And at some point, it occurred to me that those two things, the long retreat and the mythological hero, sleeping hero, could be combined together. Because one of the things that happens at the during the long retreat is the senior leaders are killed, and some other people have to take over. So in this case, it's the mythical hero who's still suffering tremendous shock over the fact that everyone he knows is dead. And this war that he fought the first battle in is now a century later, it's still going on. But he has to, and he knows he's not this huge hero they think he is. But he also knows that if he doesn't do his best to be that person, everybody everybody on his side, the society he cares about is doomed. So he's got to do his best to get this fleet out of this impossible trap and somehow home. So those were the main genesis of the idea. Um, Although I also worked as I was writing the first part of this series, it was right after 9/11, and people were rather glibly talking about a long war against terrorism, decades and decades long. And history tells us that long wars are really corrosive to the societies involved in them, not just the militaries, but the societies themselves. So this was also offered me a way to show, here's a guy from 100 years ago when this war was just starting, and he's encountering all these people who've been fighting this war for a century, and things have gone downhill, to put it mildly. Um, so he's confronting the impacts of this long war on the society and on the fleet that he cares about. And he lets them know where he thinks they've gone astray as a result. So those are probably the three main influences in it.
Yeah, and so aside from the mainline stories in that Lost Fleet series, you've also written several spin-off series that take place within that same universe. How do you keep all the details straight across so many books set within the same fictional universe? I'm curious, do you have maybe like a series Bible document that you use to preserve the continuity?
It's still mostly in my head, and that's because things are interrelated. Um, for example, the after I did the initial 6 books in the Lost Fleet series, and they said, "Okay, we want more books." Okay, you have to worry about keeping everything fresh, everything still feeling as energetic as when you started writing the first book. So as part of extending the main story of the Lost Fleet, I said I also want to do this one, The Lost Stars, which is set same time period, but in a former enemy star system, because that will give me a totally different perspective on everything that's going on. And that'll let me think, but everything's interacting as well, all these events. Um, so you can read the books of the Lost Stars and the Lost Fleet Outlands one after the other, and you can see how they tie together, or you can read them individually. Don't force people to read books. Um, and then after that, I needed some time to think about a new storyline, but I thought about writing prequels. How did the Alliance form in the first place? What were the things that made people get together into it? And that gave me a chance to deal with the ancestors who play a prominent role in the Lost Fleet. The idea that the ancestors are watching over and trying to guide us and um, keep their people as much out of trouble as possible. And then finally, the latest one, the Outland series, um, which again a continuation and bringing some strings together. And I would probably avoid a few missteps if I kept a Bible, but so far it's in my head, um, and so far it's working.
Hey, that's impressive. Um, We have I'll get into audience Q&A in a minute. We've got a good question here submitted from the crowd. Thank you for that. So I wanted to touch on something. So your novels are often praised for their detailed descriptions of kind of the tactical military strategies used in battle scenes, as well as the immersive world building aspects, which we already touched on. But your books are also highly character driven, featuring interpersonal conflicts with your main characters throughout. When you're writing a new novel or starting a new series, does that kind of typically start with the characters, or do you tend to start more from a conceptual lens with world building and strategy?
Um, it's really integrated. I mean, I start imagining the scenario, like in the case of In Our Stars, this situation where you've got somebody with a part alien DNA and somebody else from another time period. And as I'm working that through, the characters needed to tell that story come to me as well. Um, so it's kind of an integrated process, I guess you could say, where the characters are coming to me and saying, "This is who I am. Uh, this is what I need. This is my name, and what I'm going to do, and how that fits into the story or modifies it in some ways." Sometimes I have a series which is called Jag in Space, where I had made more of an outline than I usually do. And I already had all the main characters laid out and everything. And in the first part of the first book, as my lead point of view character is reporting to his first ship, he goes around a corner and there's a character I've never imagined up to that point. And she's standing there in the hallway, and I know her name, I know her personality, I know everything about her all of a sudden. And I thought to myself, okay, if she just showed up out of nowhere, obviously she's got to be important. So I ran with it. And she did turn out to be incredibly important to the series and the story. So um, it does feel as if they come up and introduce themselves and say, okay, you need me in this story for this role. So here I am. And if they work, great. And I use them that way. And I guess it sounds kind of mystical, but I mean, nobody knows how this process works. And that's how it feels for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we received some good questions here from Ekaterina, who is a writer themselves. So they asked, how do you find inspiration for your stories, and how do you overcome writer's block?
Ah, well, inspiration. I try to open myself to a lot of different things. Movies, trips, learning about new things all the time, because you never know what might spark an idea and how those ideas will come together to form the story. Um, the more you open yourself up to, I think, the more likely some inspiration will come. There's only so many basic stories out there. I think somebody said there's only something like 10 plots possible, and everything's just a variation on those. It's what you do with those plots that matters, your own individual spin on them. So the more experience you get with viewing what other people have done with stories or history, historical events, um, the more opportunities your mind has to try to put things together in a different way. And again, this, I think, for an author, at least for me, part of this idea of seeing things in a different way is trying to see a familiar story in a different way. That, okay, this story was done in this way, so what if we told it somewhat differently? What if we handled things in a different way? So, for example, the time travel aspects of In Our Stars, I've looked at a lot of time travel stories. One of the best is The Girl Who Leaped Through Time, a movie from Japan, um, because those gave me ideas both about the ideas of time travel and changes and everything else that goes into them. Um, Writer's block, diversions, I guess, trying something else for a little while. If I'm really stuck in a story, maybe I'll leave it right there and jump over it to a later part of the book and start writing that and trust that I'll figure it out. Um, or again, just do something totally not connected to that story. Read a nonfiction book about something else and give it time to work in the back of my mind, take the pressure off, and then the ideas will come. There's no guaranteed one way. When it comes to writing, there's no guaranteed one way for anything. Um, but that's what works for me. And that's what really matters isn't some rule or what works for someone else, but trying different things and seeing what works for you. Generally, there is one other thing I do in relation to writer's block. Almost every time I find that my story is stalled, it's because I'm being too nice to the characters. I haven't thrown enough obstacles at them, enough problems. And once I do that, once I make things harder, then the story gets moving again. Because now there are these challenges. Now the characters have to figure their way around them. So that's one of the things I advise people if they're stuck on a story is, are you being too nice to your characters? Are you making it too easy on them? Throw rocks at them and see if that gets things going.
That's great. I haven't heard that before.
And it's supposedly Mark Twain, when he was asked about his writing process, he said that he chased his characters up trees and threw rocks at them. And yeah, that's a good summary of it, I think.
That's great. So we received some other questions kind of related to writing process and kind of what a typical day looks like for you. So you've been incredibly prolific over the last 20 plus
Mm.
years of your writing career. You've published more than 40 novels in that span. How do you maintain that level of creative productivity? Like, and could you just kind of walk us through what your routine looks like?
Well, I don't really have a routine when it comes to writing. Some people do. Some writers have a very strict, they write from this time of day to this time of day, and they, churn out 4,000 words a day, that kind of thing. I can't do that. If I force myself to write when it's not right, boy, you can tell by what I put down on the page. It has to work. And when it does work, it can come really quickly. Um, the fastest story I ever wrote was it was a prequel to The Pillars of Reality, which part of the plot for that rested on prophecy about an old uh, explorer, pirate, military hero named Jules, and said that a daughter of Jules's line would someday free the world. Um, and that plays a big role in Pillars of Reality. Well, one day out of nowhere, Jules showed up in my head, and she's telling me, this prophecy really screwed up my life, and you must tell people about this. And she just rode me constantly until I got her book done. And that's the fastest I ever wrote a book, I think. I got, it was 94,000 words in 2.5 weeks, which was a killing pace. I don't think I could ever do that again. But she was pretty relentless when it came to that. Um, so I guess you could say that, well, my output has been steady in terms of books per year. My writing can be anything but steady. If the inspiration is there, I will be able to get a lot of words done pretty quickly. If the inspiration isn't there, I may take a long time to get short sections completed. It just varies, and I don't know if there's any specific key. This is just, again, as it is for me. For other people, it's very much different. But for me, a routine hasn't worked. Instead, I have to be open to it. And when the inspiration comes, whenever that is, get to work on it.
And do you typically do most of your writing at home in your office, or are you one of those people who likes to go to the Starbucks or the library and then start writing?
No, usually it's been at home in my office. Of course, when I was primary caregiver for the kids, I had to be home a lot anyway. So, watching them and which also kept me from having a writing routine. Um, and then, but otherwise, yeah, mostly in the office, which the Hero of the Lost Fleet books paid for. Um, I do most of my writing there, yeah. Although sometimes I was on a trip driving from Kansas to back to Maryland, and this scene just kept coming in my head. I had to pull over into a parking lot in Missouri, I think it was, and write down this scene because it just kept coming to me. So sometimes elsewhere, but usually in my office.
Great. Let's see, we had another question from one of our writers in the crowd here. So how do you incorporate your personal experiences into your books? And I'm curious, as a follow-up, do you think maybe your military background kind of helped you keep your work ethic so productive? I think many of us struggle to get through our emails throughout the day, and you've published 40 books in 20 years.
Well, the great thing about the naval experience was it forced me to do a lot of things I wouldn't have chosen to do, like a lot more knowledge of technical matters and math than I might have otherwise pursued. So it gave me that experience. It also gave me experience with meeting a lot of different people from different places, different cultures, different ways of viewing things. And that's had an immense impact on my ability to um, visualize different situations and different people. And all of those people I met, um, every female character I get draws to some extent from women I have known, some of their characteristics. That's how you get them to feel real because they've got the characteristics of real people in them. So every person I have known has contributes to the characters, and the situations I have been in contribute to the stories. So um, what was the first part of the question again?
Yeah, I think you pretty much got to it, but it was basically just about incorporating your personal
Yes,
experience
yes.
into your
It's
book.
and that's, I mean, again, the Jag in Space series is probably the most personal in the sense that it's based most closely on my experience on surfer ships. Every incident that triggers court martials in there, I was is based on something I was personally involved with in the real world. And the characters in that series are most drawn directly from people I served with. But as I said, everybody else, every situation, the differences between the way aviators talk and the way engineers talk, all these things came from my experiences going out, meeting people, doing things, um, seeing the different ways that different cultures look at questions and the different answers they find, all those things.
And I'm curious, do you ever feel like you kind of insert yourself into the story to its extent? I've read some readers have kind of hypothesized that Captain Jack Black could kind of be an extension of yourself and to some extent.
Well, Captain Geary is he's a far better officer than I ever was. Eh, he may be idealized in a sense, although he makes plenty of mistakes. Um, I guess I do insert myself in the sense that despite everything, I'm still an optimist when it comes to human beings. Um, and again, something I learned in the Navy, most of your problems are going to be caused by people, but all of your solutions are going to come from people. And I think that is something from me, my experience that carries through that my characters are going to find answers, that failure is not an option, as the saying goes. And they're going to persist and keep trying to do the right thing regardless. And to that extent, those characters, I guess, are extensions of me continuing to try their best.
That's great. And question here from one of your readers. Would you consider revisiting the Paul Sinclair Jag and Space world in
Oh,
the future?
I definitely would. Uh, I don't know if the question knows there were 4 books, and then I did get one novella done, which is called Failure to Obey. But since then, I've been open to doing more, but the lead character in that, an officer named Paul Sinclair, will not talk to me. I have attempted to start another book a few times, And each time, Paul simply will not tell me what happens. So I'm open to it, but first he has to be willing to talk to me again, and so far he has not been. Um, Best
And
answer I can give.
okay, well that's good to know that we may be getting future stories one day.
Yeah.
And since we've had a lot of questions about kind of the writing process, I'm curious how many revisions you would say do your novels go through, or how different is your original manuscript from what we read once it hits the shelf?
Well, the way I do revisions is I do them as I write. And so like, well, in the latest book I've been working on, for example, I realized at one point I was about at chapter 7 or something that I'd never taken people to a certain place that people would want to know about. So I went back and I inserted a whole new chapter 4, in which you get a virtual visit to that place in some detail. Um, that's the way, since I'm doing that as I write, I don't really think of it in terms of, revision 1, revision 2, um, until I've sent it off to my agent and my editor. And then they will usually suggest some changes, which remarkably are usually not major. Um, I take care of those, and after that, the revisions are usually just in the form of answering questions from copy editors, that kind of thing. Um, so because my revision process is continual, I can't really say how many discrete versions there are, but it's just an ongoing process where I'm trying to fix things and identify problems. At the end of writing any book, I have to go through and read it right from the beginning all the way through and make sure everything still hangs together and I haven't put in contradictions or left things out or anything like that. So um, that's something that's made possible easy with word processors. I don't know how well I'd do if we were still in the age of typewriters.
And let's see, we have a good question here from a writer in the crowd here. They say, I'm also a big fan of 1960s science fiction, like
Hmm.
Andre Norton, Paul Anderson, Clifford Seamak. And I've written a book about a xenobiologist uncovering a conspiracy on the distant moon of Ceres. The length is about 120,000 words. Where would I submit such a text? Many publishing houses refuse to accept books from new writers.
Um, it's there's a catch 22 in the publishing world today, where you really ought to have an agent to get a novel sold. But if you haven't sold a novel, it's very hard to get an agent. And there's no simple answer to that except to continue trying to get an agent. There are sometimes publishers who will look at manuscripts. You have to stay open to them. Um, and there are agencies that will accept you. If you go to certain conventions, you can find editors there from these are the big conventions, things like Comic-Con in San Diego, Dragon Con in Atlanta. You can find editors from major publishers, and you have an opportunity to talk to them. Uh, Agents will also be at some of these conventions. And there are other writers there who might be able to introduce you to people who can help you meet it. So those kind of personal contacts, I think, help a great deal. Um, and there's a website maintained by the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, um, which is called Writer Beware, which lays out not only which specific publishers and agents you should stay away from based on their track records, but also advice on ways to contact other agencies and what contracts should look like, all that kind of thing. So I would urge you to check out that site for what it can tell you about getting in contact with an agent. Get to get to some conventions in your area that agents would be at, and if you buy an agent or a writer or an editor a drink, they'll probably listen to you for at least a little while. Um, but that kind of personal contact, I think, is one of your best bets today with the amount of material out there. Is if you can meet someone, that's a chance.
And do you think the publishing landscape for sci-fi fantasy has changed much in your time? When was your first novel came out in the early 2000s, correct?
The first, yes, yes. Um, well, there's always the big things rippling through. You know, there's before Harry Potter and there's after Harry Potter, right? Um, and publishers tend to always be chasing the last big thing, thinking that's going to be the next big thing, even though the next big thing is always something different than the last big thing. Earlier this year, my agent tells me that every publisher was only looking for romanticities. That's all they wanted. Well, surprisingly enough, the market for romanticities has been saturated already. So they're looking at other things now. So definitely science fiction, all other genres change as society changes, as culture changes. Military science fiction, for example, reflects the experiences of the military personnel who've gone through. You look at um, the stuff immediately after World War II, and then you see the stuff that was written by the veterans of Vietnam, like Joe Haldeman, Forever War. And then you have the things which were written between then and in the later stages of the Cold War. But then now you've got the veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq who are writing stuff that's a lot like the stuff that was written by the veterans of Vietnam, unfortunately. Not just within military SF, that shows you how these things cycle. And it always reflects what your society is going through. Right now, there's a lot of dystopian stuff because people um, feel like the world's off its rails. Um, I think that's why there's plenty of room for stuff that isn't dystopian. Um, so it's going to change in that respect. And then the mechanics of publishing have changed a huge amount. Um, all the stuff online, the social media, all this kind of thing. Self-publishing has gone from being something that usually was um, not going to take you anywhere to something that potentially could be huge for any individual. Although that also means that getting noticed with all these self-published works coming out has become much, much harder. So, I mean, that's something you could talk about for hours, the changes in the mechanisms of the publishing industry. Nobody really knows where it's going to go down the line at all. Legacy publishing, self-publishing, all of these things. It's still working itself out and probably will be for another couple decades.
All right. Well, we're starting to run out of time here, but I want to ask you a couple quick questions before we head out here. So, do you still find time in your schedule to read for pleasure? If so, what have you been reading lately?
Um, I don't find enough time, I think. One of the paradoxes of being a writer is that you become a writer because you love to read, but once you become a full-time writer, you don't have nearly enough time to read.
Hmm.
Um, I do enjoy taking a break with a well-done anime series or uh, a foreign series. Right now, my family's watching. My roommate is a gomiho, which is Korean for a nine-tailed fox spirit. The last book I read is The Cleopatras, which is about the Ptolemies ruling Egypt and all the different Cleopatras who were queens during that time period. Because history is a great source of plots. You can steal all kinds of plots from history and new situations that people don't even realize. So that's I'm likely these days to read nonfiction because it's well, reading fiction is writing fiction is work. So relaxing usually means nonfiction these days, and that also helps feed inspiration.
That's great. And so, lastly, I wanted to ask, what's next for you after book two of the Doomed to Earth series comes out? Do you already have a planned book after that, or are you already working on
Well,
something currently?
there's the one I'm working on, which has been described as Jack Campbell's Aliens. You know, the movie. Only I'm not doing it as a horror thing, which has been repeated time after time in movie after movie. but rather as an actual space opera type situation. What if the people involved were not stupid? What if they really did try to cope with this difficult situation as best they could? It's in no way a ripoff of the aliens in the movie, but it's about a situation where people who are totally unprepared have to somehow overcome the challenges they're faced with. And so that book is currently being shopped around by my agent. And after that, well, I'm trying to work out what the next thing is at this point. Um, I would People would like another Lost Fleet book, but after so many, it gets harder and harder to write new stories in the same universe. And I don't want to just churn out something to make money off of it. I want to make sure it's a good story for people. So I'm not sure what will come after that at this point. I'm waiting on the muse to hit me over the head with something.
Absolutely. Well, and could you remind us again the title of your book two for Doomed Earth?
Destiny's Way.
Destiny's Way, and that's coming out in February 2025.
Yes.
All right, excellent. Well, keep your eyes out for that one. We'll certainly have it at the library, but also available wherever books are sold. I really appreciate you taking the time, John, to chat with me tonight and to chat with our community. It's really been a pleasure. And I also want to thank everyone for asking good questions and participating. It's really been a fun evening.
Well, thank you. It's always fun to talk to people about things. It's a fascinating group of individuals you meet in this business.
Absolutely. And just to the folks in the crowd here, I did just put a little link in the, oh, actually, let me switch that to everyone and paste this in one more time. That's just a link for some of our last events for Sci-Fi September this year. We have a science talk coming up next week, as well as a retro gaming event related to sci-fi and video games and computer games. So hope to see some of you there. And thanks again, John, for chatting with us, and really appreciate you taking the time. Have a good evening.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Thank you, everyone.